The ring was too big. That was the first thing I noticed when Walter Larkin slid it onto my finger in front of a room full of people who clapped like they meant it. The gold band spun loose, threatening to fall, and I pressed my thumb against it to keep it from slipping while the officiant finished reciting words I had stopped hearing around the third sentence. The ring was too big, and the man standing across from me was a stranger, and the flowers on the altar smelled the way hospitals smell, clean and slightly wrong. Like someone had scrubbed something away that wasn't meant to be removed. Walter did not look at me when the room clapped. He looked at some point just past my shoulder, his jaw a clean, hard line, his posture so immaculate it seemed like a performance rather than a natural state of being. He was wearing a dark suit, charcoal gray, and his dark hair was swept back from his face with the kind of effortless precision that I suspected cost considerable effort. He was, without argument, the most striking man I had ever stood this close to, and he felt as warm and accessible as a marble floor in January. My name is Mark Ramsey. I was 26 years old on my wedding day, fresh out of a graduate program in architectural design that I had thrown my entire self into because I had known for most of my adult life that my family had other plans for the rest of me. My father's business dealings and Walter Larkin's family's interests had been tangled together for years in ways I had never been fully explained. All I knew was that one afternoon during my final semester, my father had called me into his study with the particular brand of measured calm that meant there was no room for discussion, and told me that my engagement to Walter Larkin had been arranged, that the wedding would be in 4 months, and that this was a good match, a fortunate match, and that he hoped I would come to see it that way. I had stared at the wall behind my father's head for a long time. There was a painting there, a landscape, very green, very flat. I had looked at it and thought about the way perspective works, how a road can appear to vanish at the horizon, not because it ends, but because the eye can only follow so far. Then I had nodded, because what other geometry was available to me in that room? Walter and I met exactly 3 times before the wedding. All 3 meetings were brief, formal, conducted in the presence of others. The first was a dinner with both our families. The second was a brief walk arranged so that our photographs could be taken for an announcement. The third was a fitting for the ceremony, where we stood side by side while someone adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and I held the ring box because there was nothing else to hold. He had been polite at each meeting, measured. He had asked about my degree and nodded at my answers with the attentiveness of someone attending a required lecture on a subject that didn't quite reach them. When he smiled, it was with the lower half of his face only. I did not expect warmth. I had not let myself build that expectation, because expectation with no foundation is just a longing you have to eventually dismantle by hand. What I had not anticipated was the silence. Not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. Walter Larkin, I would come to understand, had a great deal to say about many things, and he said them incisively and well. In meeting rooms and over phone calls I could hear through walls. No. The silence he offered me was something more deliberate. It was the silence of a man who had decided, quite consciously, that I did not require his voice. That whatever was happening between us, this arrangement, this legal and logistical pairing, could be conducted at a remove. That he could be present in a house without being present to me. We moved into his home. A large, quietly beautiful place with high ceilings and windows that faced a garden, on the same afternoon as the wedding. There was no honeymoon. That had been understood without being stated. The household staff were kind and efficient and looked at me with the carefully neutral expressions of people trained not to notice things. I was shown to my room, not our room, my room. My room. It was on the same floor as his, at the opposite end of a long hallway. It was well appointed and impersonal, and someone had arranged fresh flowers on the dresser, which was a kindness that made the whole situation feel more rather than less lonely. The first week, Walter and I occupied the house like 2 weather systems that had agreed to share an atmosphere without interacting. We ate breakfast at different times. We passed each other in hallways and exchanged words that were courteous and minimal. He left early and returned late. When he was home, he worked, alone in his study, and the light under the door was the primary evidence that he was there at all. I unpacked my books and my drafting tools and set up a small work table in the corner of my room. I called my college roommate, a person named Dex, who understood what to say and when to say nothing, and I described the house to him instead of describing what living in it felt like, because the second category of information was not yet something I had organized enough to share. I told Dex the ceilings were extraordinary. Coffered, original molding, the kind of architectural integrity that people strip out of houses and immediately regret. I told him the garden was overgrown in a way that was either neglect or very deliberate romanticism, and I hadn't yet determined which. Dex listened to all of this and then said, "And the husband?" I looked at the closed door of my room for a moment. "Coffered," I said. "Original molding." Dex made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and we talked about other things until the room around me had gotten dark enough that I had to turn on the lamp. The days accumulated. I developed routines the way you develop them when you are trying to give shape to time that would otherwise feel formless. I woke early and went to the kitchen before anyone else was likely to be there and made coffee the way I liked it. And I sat by the large window in the kitchen and looked at the garden while I drank it. I worked on freelance design projects in the mornings because my degree was mine regardless of what my personal life looked like, and I intended to use it. In the afternoons I walked, always in a different direction, learning the geography of the neighborhood the way you learn any new language, by getting slightly lost and then finding your way back. I had been there almost 2 weeks when Walter came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and did not immediately leave. This was new. I registered it without turning around and took an extra moment with the coffee press to give myself time to organize my face. "You're up early," he said. It was a neutral observation, not warm, not unfriendly. "I always am," I said. "There's enough for 2 if you want." A pause. Then, "All right." I got down a second mug. I poured coffee into it and set it on the counter near where he'd come to stand, and I took my own mug to the window. It was raining, which was doing interesting things to the light in the garden. He didn't say anything for a while. I didn't either, but it was the first silence between us that hadn't felt entirely like a closed door. He left before I finished my coffee, with his mug rinsed and placed in the rack, and he nodded once in my direction as he went. It was not much. It was the smallest possible notation of acknowledgement, but I held it in my mind, the way you hold a new word in a foreign language, testing its shape, its weight, wondering how often you might have occasion to use it. There is a particular loneliness that lives inside a house that should feel like a home. I had been lonely before. Graduate school has a specific brand of it. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who are all separately buried in their own work, all moving through the same spaces, but in entirely different interior directions. I had felt the loneliness of my family's expectations pressing against the life I was trying to build around them, the particular grief of wanting to be seen as a person rather than a piece in a larger arrangement. But this was different. This was the loneliness of proximity. Walter Larkin was 30 feet away at almost any given moment, in this house, behind a wall or a door, and the distance between us might as well have been continental. I began to notice things about him the way you notice things about weather. Not because you've decided to pay attention, but because your survival instincts require you to read the conditions. He took his coffee with no sugar. He kept his study in a precise order that was not sterile but considered, like a mind that thought in systems. He had books on 3 subjects that surprised me: structural biology, classical music history, and the poetry of a writer whose name I recognized from a course I'd taken in my first year of university. He walked through the house quietly, with the self-contained energy of someone who had learned long ago to take up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. He was not unkind to me. I want to be precise about this, because I have told this story to myself many times, and I have been careful about accuracy. Walter Larkin was never unkind to me. He was distant. He was reserved to a degree that bordered on the clinical. But he did not diminish me, did not speak to me with condescension, did not make me feel like a burden in the way that some men in his position might have. He treated me with a kind of formal courtesy that was respectful without being personal, and for a long time I told myself that was enough. The fourth week, I made dinner. I hadn't been asked to. The household had a cook, a quiet and efficient woman who left meals at predictable hours and disappeared. But I had been in the kitchen late in the afternoon and the light was very good, and I had all the ingredients for a pasta dish my mother had made when I was young, and making it felt like holding on to something. I made enough for two without thinking too hard about why. When Walter came home at 7, early for him, I was plating it, and the kitchen smelled of garlic and tomato and something herb and warm, and he stopped in the doorway for a brief, unreadable moment. "You cooked," he said. "You don't have to eat it," I said. "I made too much by accident." He looked at the table, set for two, and then at me, and something moved across his face that was too quick to read. He washed his hands and sat down, and I sat across from him, and we ate together for the first time since the wedding dinner, which had been catered and loud and had felt nothing like sharing a meal. He ate without speaking, but he ate everything on his plate, and when he was finished, he was quiet for a moment and then looked at me directly, which was also something new, and said, "That was very good." The words were simple. They were probably the simplest compliment available. But he'd said them looking straight at me, not past me, and his voice had dropped into a register that was different from the one he used when he was being professionally courteous. And something in my chest responded to this like a plant responding to light. Not a dramatic unfurling, just a slight, almost imperceptible turning toward. "It was my mother's recipe," I said. He nodded slowly, and I thought that was the end of it. Then he said, "What does she think of all this?" I put down my fork. I hadn't expected the question, not because it was forward. It was a perfectly reasonable question, but because it was the first personal question he had asked me in the weeks we had been living in the same house. "She thinks I'm adjusting well," I said. "I'm a good writer of reassuring texts." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And are you? Adjusting well?" I looked at him. He was looking back at me, and his expression was careful, measured, but there was something in it, a watchfulness that wasn't detached, that was actually paying attention. "I'm finding my way around," I said, which was true and incomplete in equal measure. He nodded again and looked at the table, and I thought that was it. But then he stayed. He didn't move to stand, didn't offer the kind of polite finality that usually punctuated our interactions. He stayed at the table, and I got up and poured water, and I sat back down, and we were there together in the warm kitchen light for another 20 minutes without saying much. And it was the most present I had felt since moving in. He went to his study after. The light came on under the door, but something had shifted, very slightly, the way a foundation shifts. Invisibly, in the deep structure, where the change won't be visible on the surface for some time. I lay in my bed that night and thought about the question he'd asked, whether I was adjusting well. Not whether I was happy, not whether I liked the house, but whether I was adjusting, as though he understood that this was a thing that required active effort rather than passive acceptance. As though he recognized, on some level, that what I'd been doing these past weeks was work. That recognition, small as it was, felt like something. I turned over in the dark and listened to the house settle around me, and the ring on my finger was still too big, and I was still 30 feet and several walls away from the man I'd married. And everything was still strange and unresolved, but the strangeness had acquired the first faint texture of familiarity, and that, I told myself, was how all translations begin. No one warned me about the nightmares. They had always visited even before. Scattered occurrences, bad dreams that left residue on waking images that dissolved when I reached for them and left only a feeling behind. Like the smell of something burning in a room where you can't find the source. But they had been manageable. They had been mine, and I had managed them with the somewhat unreliable method of not going to sleep at the first sign of being tired. Wearing myself out enough that the drop into sleep was fast and deep and dreamless. That system did not survive the adjustment to a new environment. In Walter's house, in the unfamiliar quiet of my room at the far end of that long hallway, the nightmares returned with a consistency that felt like punishment. I dreamed the usual architecture of distress. running through spaces that kept reconfiguring, looking for people in rooms that turned out to be empty, standing at the edge of something I couldn't see the bottom of. Standard issue anxiety, cataloged and familiar. I had language for it during the day. At 3 in the morning, language was unavailable, and all that was left was the feeling, which was large and cold and very certain. I was careful not to let it show. I was good at the morning face, the face that says I slept fine, the face that pours coffee and reads a book and does not give the night away. It was a skill I had developed over years, and I deployed it fluently. But the night of the 6th week, a night that had been preceded by a particularly relentless day, a failed design proposal, a difficult call with my father, the particular weight of an evening in which Walter and I had been in the same room without finding anything to say. The nightmare arrived with an intensity I was not prepared for. I won't describe it in detail. Nightmares are, I think, mostly untranslatable. They make their impact through the private logic of your own fears and report it to someone else. They sound either absurd or mundane. What I can tell you is that it involved loss on a scale that felt final, and that when I woke, I was sitting up in bed with my hands braced against the mattress and my heart performing something that wasn't quite a normal rhythm, and there were tears on my face that I hadn't known I was shedding. I sat there in the dark and breathed. The house was quiet. The clock on my phone read 2:47. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and breathed. I didn't hear the door open. I heard, instead, a knock, quiet but distinct, 3 sounds against wood, and then Walter's voice, low and careful. "Mark." I lowered my hands. I stared at the door, which was still closed. My heart was still doing its uneven thing. "Mark, are you all right?" I opened my mouth, and what came out was not the reassurance I had intended, not the collected, fine, yes, sorry to wake you that I had readied. What came out was silence, and then a sound that was embarrassingly close to not all right, and then I pressed my hand over my mouth, because I was not going to do this. I was not going to fall apart in the dark while my cold and distant husband stood on the other side of my door. "I'm going to come in," Walter said. Not a question, not quite an announcement, just a statement, delivered in a tone that was very quiet and very even, and before I could decide how to respond, the door opened. He was dressed, not formally, not in the suit and precision of his public self, but in the way of someone who had been awake rather than just woken up. Dark pants, a plain shirt, the top buttons undone. His feet were bare. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room, reading me, and I sat in the middle of my bed with tears I couldn't take back on my face and no adequate language for any of it. He came into the room. He didn't say anything at first. He crossed to the side of the bed, and he sat on the edge of it. Not close, not intrusively, but present in a way that rearranged the atmosphere of the room completely. And he looked at me, and his expression was not the controlled, managed thing I had grown accustomed to. It was, instead, concerned. Plainly and directly concerned, with no professional filtration, no careful distance. Just a person looking at another person in the dark and being worried. "Bad dream," I said. My voice was steadier than I deserved. "I heard you," he said, which explained how he'd known, which explained why he was here, in my room, at 2:47 in the morning, in bare feet. "I'm sorry I woke you." "You didn't wake me." He paused. I was in the hall. I absorbed this. The hallway ran the length of the upper floor. There was no particular reason for him to be in it at nearly 3 in the morning, unless he also had trouble with the night. "Do you do that often?" I asked. "Walk the hall at 3. He looked at the window. "Sometimes." I nodded. I wiped the last of the tears from my face with the back of my hand, unself-consciously, because there didn't seem to be a point in self-consciousness anymore. He had already seen. That ship had sailed into the dark. "Do you want water?" he said. "Yes," I said, because I did, but also because it gave him something to do, and it gave me 30 seconds to put myself back together. He went to the bathroom attached to my room and came back with a glass, and I drank it, and he sat back down on the edge of the bed. I expected him to say something about going back to his room. I waited for the polite extraction, the reasonable good night. He didn't move. "Do you want to tell me what it was?" he asked. And the way he asked it, quietly, without pressure, the door open, but no one forcing me through it, made me feel, very unexpectedly, like I could. So I did. Haltingly, imprecisely, in the way that nightmares always come out when you try to put them in language. I told him the impressions rather than the narrative. The feeling of looking for someone who wasn't there. The particular quality of being too late for something irreversible. The loneliness of it. The way it had felt, in the dream, like that loneliness was permanent. He listened. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it or offer the practical reassurances that people offer when they're uncomfortable with emotion. He listened in the way of someone who understood that listening was the thing that was being asked for, and that solving it wasn't on the table. When I'd run out of words, there was a silence. Then he said, quietly, "That sounds like a hard way to wake up." It was such a simple statement, not elaborate, not performed, just an acknowledgement. And it landed somewhere in me like warmth landing on cold skin, not painless exactly. The way coming in from the cold isn't painless, but welcome. "It was," I said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Try to sleep." I looked at him, at this man who had been a stranger, and was still largely a stranger, sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark in his bare feet, and I said, without planning to, "Would you stay for a bit? You don't have to. But, would you?"
Why?
The silence afterward was just long enough that I was certain he would say no, was certain I had misjudged the degree of warmth in the room, was preparing never mind, forget I asked. "Yes," he said. He shifted, moving to sit against the headboard on top of the covers at a careful distance, and I lay back against my pillow. And the room settled into a quiet that was different from any quiet I had experienced in this house. Not empty, not full of managed absence, just quiet. I don't know how long it took me to fall asleep, but I did, without the nightmare returning, with his quiet presence filling the space beside me like something that had always been there and had only just been noticed. When I woke in the morning, the space beside me was empty, but the impression of it remained. He didn't mention it. The next morning, at breakfast, I had started making breakfast for two without either of us acknowledging this as a thing that was happening. He poured coffee and read something on his phone and was his usual self, contained and measured and neat about it. I ate toast and looked at the garden and did not bring up the night before, because his silence on the subject felt like privacy rather than dismissal, and I was learning to read the difference. But something had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way you could point to and say, there, that's where it shifted. It was more like the way a key that has always been slightly stiff in the lock begins, over time, to turn a little more freely. Not fixed, just easier. Like whatever mechanism governed the distance between us had been adjusted, almost imperceptibly, towards something less absolute. He came home earlier, not every day, but more days than before. And when he was home, he was more present is the word I'm reaching for, though it's imprecise. He was in the rooms where I was. Not intrusive, not suddenly hovering, but there. Present in the way of someone who has decided that the room another person occupies is a room worth being in. He asked me questions. Small ones. The kind that seem like nothing but are actually a form of infrastructure. What I was working on. How my day had gone. Whether I'd managed to get to the section of the neighborhood I'd mentioned wanting to walk. I answered and asked my own small questions in return, and gradually, the way all slow buildings rise, we built a thing between us that was made of these small exchanges. I learned that he was not cold so much as carefully held. There is a difference, and it took time to see it. Cold is the absence of warmth. Carefully held is warmth that has been, for reasons not immediately visible, contained, managed, put behind a structure that was built with intention. He had built his reserve the way I built designs, with attention to load-bearing walls, with an understanding that some elements are structural and cannot simply be removed without consequences. But careful doesn't mean immovable. I started to hear his laugh for the first time. Not often. Rarely, in fact, and always quiet, more an exhalation of genuine amusement than the social performance that most people call laughter. The first time it happened, I was telling him about a navigation failure on one of my afternoon walks. I had ended up somewhere entirely unexpected and had spent 45 minutes trying to reorient before accepting defeat and using my phone. And he made that sound. Quiet and real, and the corners of his eyes changed when he did it, and I thought, there you are. There is the person inside all this architecture. There is the actual inhabitant. He caught me looking, and his expression did that thing, closing slightly, a self-conscious adjustment. And I looked away quickly and said something else. Because I understood that the glimpse was accidental and he might not be ready for it to be acknowledged. But I held it. The way I had held the compliment about the pasta, the way I'd held the question about whether I was adjusting. I held these things carefully, added them to a collection I was keeping without quite knowing what I was going to do with it. The second nightmare was 3 weeks after the first. I didn't wake as dramatically this time. I surfaced from it slowly, the way you surface from deep water when you're not in a hurry, just gradually becoming aware of the air above you and swimming toward it. I was sitting up again when I fully woke, but quietly, no sounds this time, no evidence that I'd given myself away. But the door opened anyway. He stood in the doorway again, same bare feet, same undone shirt, and I thought he was in the hall again. Same dream? He asked. Different, I exhaled. Equally unpleasant. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. This time, there was less preamble. Less of the tentativeness of the first time, less of the territory being carefully established. He just sat, and I talked for a while, not about the dream specifically, but about the feeling it left, and he listened, and when I had run out of talking, he said, "Can I stay again?" I looked at him. The asking was new. Last time, it had been me asking. Something about the role reversal did something complicated to my chest. "Yes," I said. And he moved to sit against the headboard again, in the same place as before, and I lay down, and I fell asleep, and this time when I woke in the morning, he was still there, not awake. Actually asleep. Sitting up against the headboard, his head tipped back slightly, one hand resting open on the duvet. He looked different asleep, the careful management of his features relaxed into something younger, something that had fewer walls around it. I watched him for a moment. Not intrusively, just the way you observe anything rare and quietly beautiful. And then I got up carefully so as not to wake him and went to make coffee. He came down 20 minutes later looking mildly embarrassed with his hair slightly displaced from its usual order, and I handed him a mug without commenting on any of it, and he took it and sat across from me. And that morning we talked for an hour about nothing consequential, his work in very general terms, a book he was reading, a redesign project I'd been asked to consult on, and it was the longest, easiest conversation we'd had. There was a word forming itself in my mind in those weeks. I tried not to look at it directly, the way you don't look directly at something bright because looking directly changes the way you see it, and I wasn't ready to change how I saw this. Wasn't ready for the implications of naming what I was feeling whenever Walter was in the room, whenever he laughed that quiet private laugh. Whenever I woke in the morning to the warmth of him sleeping beside me and felt something that was the exact opposite of the loneliness I had arrived here carrying. I wasn't ready for the word. So I held it sideways in my vision and let it be what it was without calling it by name. It was raining the night it changed, not a gentle rain, the kind that means something, heavy and decisive and drumming against the windows with the energy of a verdict. I had been awake late, working on a project under the lamp at my drafting table, and the rain had been going for an hour when my concentration finally gave way to it and I turned off the lamp and got into bed. I lay in the dark and listened to the rain and thought about the fact that I was, without having planned or decided it, falling in love with my husband. I had looked at the word directly. It had been inevitable, eventually. You can only hold something sideways in your peripheral vision for so long before your eyes adjust and it's there, in full focus, undeniable. I was in love with Walter Larkin. With his careful, constructed distance and the warmth that lived underneath it, with his bare feet at 3 in the morning, and the way he held a coffee mug and the specific quality of his attention when he was genuinely listening, with the laugh he almost never produced, and the fact that I had found ways to produce it, with the way he asked questions that showed he remembered things I'd said weeks ago, Tiny things I hadn't expected anyone to retain. This was a problem. Not because love was a problem. Love was not a problem. But love without any evidence of reciprocation is not quite love yet. It's a hope attached to a fear, and the fear part of that equation was considerable. We were in an arrangement. We had entered this house from a position of obligation. Whatever softness had developed in the spaces between us might be, on his part, nothing more than the gradual normalizing of proximity, the way anyone warms, slightly, to anyone they live with long enough. I was lying there having this internal argument, my heart on one side and my well-developed instinct for self-protection on the other, when the knock came at my door. 3 sounds, quiet and distinct, his knock. I had come to know it the way you come to know the rhythms specific to one person, the weight and pattern that's entirely theirs. "Come in," I said. He opened the door and stood there, and even in the low light I could see something different about him. He was more disrupted than usual. Hair less organized, an expression on his face that had less of its habitual control. He looked, I thought, the way I must have looked both times he'd come to me after nightmares. Like something had been shaken loose in him. "Did you have a nightmare?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No. Are you all right?" Another pause, longer. He looked at the floor briefly and then back at me. And what I saw on his face in that moment was not the practiced, managed expression I'd spent months learning to read around. It was something much more open, much more raw. "I don't know," he said. I sat up. "Do you want to come in?" He crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the bed. Not on the edge this time, but properly, turning to face me, and for a moment he didn't speak, and the rain was very loud, and I waited. "I was sitting in my room," he said finally. "I was sitting in my room trying to work, and I realized that I didn't want to be there. That the room I wanted to be in was this one." He stopped, started again. And that frightened me. I didn't say anything. The air felt very careful. "Because I know what this is," he continued. "I know what it began as. I know the architecture of it, the arrangement, the practical necessity, the things neither of us chose. And I have been very deliberate about maintaining a certain—" He stopped again, and something moved across his face that was close to frustration. The frustration of a man who is good with language in professional contexts, discovering that different language is required and that he doesn't quite have it. "I've been careful," he said finally. "I know," I said. "I've noticed." He looked at me. "Has it been awful for you?" The question surprised me enough that I took a moment to answer honestly instead of reflexively. "Not awful," I said. "Lonely sometimes. In the beginning. But it's changed. It's been changing." "I know," he said. "I've been watching it change and I haven't known what to do with that. The rain against the windows." His hands resting in his lap, very still. "You could tell me what it is," I said. "What you're feeling. You don't have to have already organized it. You can say it without it being finished." He looked at me for a long moment. And then, quietly, with a care that made the words feel like something placed gently down rather than thrown, "I think I have been trying not to feel something since very shortly after you arrived, and I am tired of the effort of that." I let that sit between us. My heart was doing something significant. "What is it," I said, "that you've been trying not to feel?" He reached out and touched my face. Just the back of his fingers against my cheek, very lightly, very briefly, like a question. "You," he said. "Just you." The rain filled up all the space. I covered his hand with mine before he could draw it back, and we stayed like that for a moment, and then I turned my face and pressed my lips against his knuckles, and I felt him exhale, a long, slow release like pressure relieved, and he moved, and his other arm came around me, and I leaned into the space he made. And we sat like that in the dark while the rain said everything that we were still finding words for. He held me. Really held me, not the careful sideways presence of the nights he'd stayed after my nightmares, but a full direct embrace, one arm around my shoulders and his cheek against my hair. And I pressed my face against the side of his neck and felt his pulse and thought, this is him. Not the suit, not the controlled expression, not the precision and the managed distance. This, here, in the dark and the rain, This is actually him. I'm not going back to my room tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a declaration. It was simply a statement of a truth he had decided to stop arguing with. Good, I said. And that was the night that everything became something different. I woke to light. The rain had stopped, and the morning had arrived with the peculiar brightness that follows a heavy rain. Everything washed and crisp, the garden outside the window more vividly itself than usual. I registered all of this in the first half-second of consciousness, and then I registered the arm around my waist, the warmth along my back, the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. And I was very still for a moment while everything assembled itself. Walter was asleep behind me. His arm was around me, loose and warm. His breathing was slow and even. In the light in this arrangement, he seemed entirely at rest in a way I had not yet seen in him. Not even the mornings he'd stayed after the nightmares which had been a sitting-up sleep against the headboard. Still slightly on watch. This was different. This was someone who was, genuinely, at ease. I didn't move. I was afraid to move and break whatever this was. He woke slowly, the way he apparently slept, without drama. I felt the shift in his breathing, the small adjustment of the arm, and then he was still again, not asleep but awake, and I thought, he doesn't know how to do this either. He's trying to figure out what to do next. Good morning, I said, which I thought might help. The arm around my waist tightened slightly. Briefly. A very small, involuntary pressure, like a response that happened before the decision was made. Then, good morning. We lay there for a moment. The light was very clear. Are you all right? I asked. A pause. I think, he said carefully, that I am something considerably better than all right. I turned over to face him. He was very close, and the careful management of his face had not yet fully reinstated itself at this early hour, and what I saw there was open and clear and a little wondering. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected and found it better than they'd had any right to hope. Hi, I said, because it was all I had. Hi, he said and smiled. Actually smiled all the way, the whole face involved. And I had seen his half-smile many times, by then the social one, the polite one. But I had not yet seen this one, and it rearranged my understanding of what his face was capable of. You should know, I said, that I'm going to be difficult about this. His eyebrows moved. Difficult. Not in a bad way. I mean, I will need things, actual things, not just proximity, not just being in the same space. I'm going to need the conversation and the honesty and the parts of you that you've been keeping in the study with the lights on until midnight. The actual person, not just the consideration of him. He was quiet for a moment, and I thought perhaps I had moved too fast, asked for too much too quickly. But then he said, I know, I want to give you that. I think I've been. The distance was protective. I was protecting something I didn't fully understand yet. What were you protecting? He looked at me for a moment. Myself, I think. And you, in the way of someone who isn't sure they're safe to be close to. Why would you not be safe to be close to? I have not been close to people in a long time, he said. I don't have a recent record of doing it well. I thought about this. About the image he held of himself. This man who could run meetings and make decisions and manage the architecture of entire systems, who became uncertain precisely at the point where the system was another person. I'm not looking for evidence of past performance, I said. I'm here right now. You're here right now. That's what I have and what I'm working with. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached up and touched my hair, carefully, like something he was learning the shape of. Mark, he said. Just my name. But the way he said it was like a sentence with a whole paragraph inside it. Yes, I said, to whatever the paragraph contained. We stayed in bed for a very long time that morning. Not dramatically, not with the grand declarations that stories are supposed to deliver. We talked, really talked the way we had been circling for months, about ourselves, about the arrangement, and what we had each thought it would be, about the first weeks in this house and how they had felt from his side of the long hallway. He told me he had regretted the distance almost immediately, had found it harder than expected to maintain. had stood outside my door more than once in the early weeks before finding the particular equilibrium of controlled reserve that had gotten him through. He told me he had stayed awake on purpose some of those late nights in the hall, because the house felt different when I was in it, and he had needed some time with that feeling before he knew what to do with it. I told him about the coffee mornings, the way I'd learned his preferences before he knew I was paying that kind of attention. I told him about the word I had refused to look at directly for months, the one I had finally looked at the night before. He asked what the word was. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then, with the particular care of someone saying something true for the first time, I think I have been in exactly the same place. Only you called it something else, I said. I called it a problem to be managed, he said, which was so precisely him that I laughed and he heard my laugh and produced his own, and the room was full of it. Both of us laughing at the elaborate and unnecessary difficulty of two people arriving at the obvious, and I thought, there it is again, there is the actual person. There is the man who lives inside all that careful architecture. There is my husband. The ring was resized the following week. I had not mentioned it before, had kept pressing my thumb against it, had become practiced at it, a private, small management. But Walter noticed, finally, in the way he had been noticing things all along, quietly and without announcement. He looked at my hand one morning at breakfast and said, "That doesn't fit you properly." "It's slightly large," I said. He took my hand and held it looking at the ring, and then he looked up at me with an expression that had become familiar in the new climate we were living in, direct, warm. A little uncertain in the way of someone still learning to trust the warmth. "We should fix that," he said. "We should," I agreed. He held my hand a moment longer than necessary. Then he let go, and we finished breakfast. And later that week we went together to a jeweler, and it was resized, and when it was back on my finger it was right. Properly, exactly right. Settled and secure, and I looked at it and then looked at Walter, and he was looking at me with that full smile, the whole face one, the one that still did things to my breathing every time. And I thought, we are building something. We are, slowly and imperfectly and with full knowledge of where we started, building something real. He did not move back to his room. Not the next night, nor the one after, nor the week after that. It was never a discussion exactly. It was more like the decision had been made in the dark, in the rain, and the execution of it was simply the daily uncontested fact of it. His things migrated gradually. This is the thing people don't tell you about domestic intimacy, that it announces itself through objects before language has fully caught up. A book on the nightstand that was his. A charger on his side. His particular brand of quiet in the mornings becoming a thing I fell asleep expecting. Our room. Ours. There were adjustments, naturally. Two people sharing a space after months of parallel separate living have to learn each other's rhythms in a new register, and we were not always perfectly synchronized. He was a light sleeper, and I occasionally wasn't still enough in the night. I needed more quiet in the morning than he was initially aware of. He had a way of working in the evenings that meant his energy remained in his study even after he had physically come out of it, and learning to recognize that state and give him space to decompress was a thing I had to learn by trying and failing a couple of times first. But the key that had been stiff in the lock was turning more freely now. We were learning the language. We were doing it with the same care I would apply to a complex design. Attention to what was load-bearing, patience with the elements that couldn't be rushed. A willingness to go back and adjust rather than insisting that the first version had to be right. He started telling me things. This was the change I hadn't anticipated as significant and discovered was enormous. Walter, who had been a man of managed revelations, of carefully curated self-disclosure, began to tell me things. Small things first. The way certain kinds of music made him feel. What he'd wanted to do before the path he'd ended up on had clarified itself. What had frightened him most about the arrangement at the beginning. Then larger things. His family, and the expectations that lived there, and the ways he had shaped himself to fit them. The version of himself he had been before that shaping, which had been quieter and less guarded and more frequently wrong, and hadn't known yet to be afraid of being wrong. The friendship years ago, that had ended when he hadn't known how to be present in it when things got hard, and how that failure had calcified into a decision about closeness that had governed him ever since. I listened to these things with the full, unhurried attention that I had recognized months ago was what he needed from the people around him. Not solutions, not reframes. Just the space to put a thing down and have it received. And I told him things in return, about the loneliness of being a plan rather than a person in my family's arrangement of the world, about the grief of being good at something, the design work, the making of spaces that worked for people, the problem of how a thing exists in relation to its surroundings, and having that skill treated as a background detail by the people who were supposed to see you most fully. About the way I had arrived in his house, already practiced at being invisible in the places where I was supposed to belong, and how the months of his distance had at first felt like a familiar and confirming thing, and how slowly, so slowly, it had begun to feel like something to move through rather than accept. He listened to this with something on his face that I could not have described in the early months, but could read clearly now. A pained, careful attention. The face of someone who understands they are partially implicated in what they're hearing and is sitting with that rather than defending against it. "I'm sorry," he said when I'd finished. "You're making it different now," I said. "I want to keep making it different." "Then do," I said. "That's all. Just keep doing that." He did. Love, when it settles in and becomes domestic, is mostly unremarkable from the outside. It is the cup of coffee that appears at your elbow without you asking, made the way you take it, placed with a quiet care that says, "I have been paying attention." It is the half conversation that picks up from where it left off 3 hours ago without requiring a recap, because the shared context is established enough that you can move back in like returning to a room you know. It is the hand that finds your shoulder when you're standing at the window with your thoughts somewhere complicated, not speaking, just there. Walter learned me. This was the thing I had not quite prepared for, not falling in love with him, which I had at least had some warning about, but the experience of being learned by him, being studied with the same intensity he brought to everything he cared about. He noticed when my mood was weighted differently, registered the small signals I put out when a project wasn't working, remembered every small preference I'd mentioned once, and filed it with the precision of a man who did not allow important data to be mislaid. He remembered that I liked the windows open when I worked, that I needed about 15 minutes of complete quiet in the morning before I was fit to have a real conversation, that certain kinds of music, the minor key, melancholic kind, put me in a mood that I liked, but that sometimes took me to difficult places if I stayed in it too long. He remembered every book I'd mentioned wanting to read and began producing them, quietly, in places I'd find them naturally. Not presented as gifts, just placed, as though they'd always been there, as though the apartment had somehow stocked itself in advance of my preferences. I called Dex on a Friday afternoon standing in the garden, which had been gradually unovergrown over the months, until it had arrived at a state that was clearly deliberate romanticism rather than neglect. The kind of garden that is slightly wild and entirely intentional. "How are things?" Dex said. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Okay," he said, with the tone of someone readying themselves for any outcome. "I think I'm happy," I said. I wasn't sure how to say it because it feels like a complicated thing to have gotten to from where I started, but I think that's what this is." A pause. Then Dex said, in the warmest voice I had ever heard him produce, "Tell me everything." So I told him everything. About the ring that had been too big, and the long hallway, and the silence that I'd learned to read. About the nightmares and the bare feet at 3 in the morning, and the way a carefully held man can begin, given enough time and patience, to unhold. About the night of the rain and the morning after, and the gradual accumulation of everything since. Dex listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how I knew he understood. "Crawford," he said when I'd finished. "What?" "You said. That first time I asked about him, you said he was Crawford. Original molding." I looked at the garden, at the late afternoon light in it, at the place where the path turned out of sight behind the old stone wall. "He is," I said. "He absolutely is. But the thing about Crawford ceilings is that the depth is where the beauty is. The recesses, the shadows, the structure underneath. That's not a limitation, that's the design. Dex made the sound that was partly laugh and partly something else. "Mark Ramsey," he said, "you are so completely gone." "Yes," I said. "I know. It happened on a night 4 months into the new configuration. I dreamed it again, the version of the loss that found me when I was most tired, the looking and not finding, the rooms that restructured themselves into labyrinths, the voice I called without hearing an answer. But this time, when I surfaced from it, there was something different. Warmth. Specifically, the warmth of him, awake, immediately, the way he was sometimes awake before I fully surfaced, as if some part of him monitored the quality of my sleep even in his own. His hand on my shoulder, his voice, low and even, "I'm here." I opened my eyes, and it was dark, and I was in our room, in our bed, and he was right there, and I took one shuddering breath and let the dream dissolve. "I'm here," he said again. "I know," I said. "I know you are." He pulled me in, and I let him, and I pressed my face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was even and real and present, and the nightmare's residue burned off faster than it ever had before. I didn't have to be alone in it, metabolizing it by myself in the dark. He was already there. He would still be there in the morning. "Tell me," he said. "In a minute," I said, against his chest. "In a minute. Right now, I'm just being here." He held me. He held me with the particular quality of someone who has learned how to hold, who has practiced it enough that it has become a fluency rather than an effort. One hand moving, slow and steady, up and down my back, his chin above my head. "There was a point," I said after a while, "when I would wake up from these and be completely alone in them, and I would just manage, get through to morning. And I never thought about what it would feel like to not be alone in them. I didn't let myself think about it because it didn't seem available." "I know," he said. "I know you didn't. And now you're always here." I looked up at him. "You didn't even need to be woken up. I woke on my own, something in your breathing." He paused. "I've learned the sound of it." I looked at him in the dark. This man who had learned the sound of my sleeping, who monitored it even in his own rest, who had been in the hallway at 3 in the morning before we were even anything to each other yet. "Walter," I said. "Yes, when you came to my door that first time, the nightmare, the first one. You said you were in the hall." "Yes. Why were you in the hall?" A pause. A pause. The kind of pause that contains something that's been held for a while, waiting for the right question. "I was worried about you," he said finally. "I had been. I noticed that your lights were on later than usual most nights, that you seemed tired in the mornings. I didn't ask, because I had committed to a distance, and I didn't want to intrude. But I found myself in the hallway, some nights, just making sure the house was all right. Making sure I was all right." "Yes." I looked at him. "You were already watching out for me, months before you said anything." "I couldn't help it," he said simply. I turned this over. This man who had been in the hallway for months, watching the light under my door, listening for things, caring across a distance because he had committed to a distance and cared anyway, regardless. Despite the commitment, despite the control. "Walter Larkin," I said. "Yes, you were already in love with me." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I think I was probably in love with you before I was willing to understand what I was." I turned my face into his neck and breathed. He held on. "Me too," I said. "Here is what I know now. On the other side of all of it, the arrangement was never the point. Whatever calculation or practicality had brought us into the same house was the vehicle, not the destination. The destination was always this. The two of us, learning each other's particular gravity, orbiting closer and closer until the distance was no longer navigable and we became, finally, one continuous thing. The ring on my finger fits now. Has fit for a long time. I have stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing familiar weight. And now the only time I am specifically aware of it is when Walter touches my hand, which he does regularly, with an ease that cost him something to arrive at and that he extends without hesitation. Now the habituated tenderness of a man who has crossed a threshold and found no reason to go back. He doesn't go back. That is the truest version of the story. He came to my door on a night when I was alone in the dark and frightened, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and he stayed, and then he came back the next time, and the time after, and eventually the coming back became the staying, and the staying became the us of it, permanent and unhurried and true. We live in the room together now. Have for long enough that the memory of the long hallway, of the separate doors and the managed distance and the silences that were closed rather than open, has begun to feel like a different story about different people. We go to sleep the same time most nights, and I always know which side of the bed is mine because there are two sides now, and we have become specific to our own. I know his weight in sleep, the particular way he breathes when he's deeply under and when he's just at the surface. He knows the sound of my nightmares coming before I wake. He knows the sound of my nightmares coming. That is the thing I come back to. Not the large moments. Though there were large moments the night in the rain. The morning after the first time he said out loud plainly without architecture or management that he loved me, which he did eventually. On an ordinary afternoon in the kitchen when I was doing something entirely unremarkable, and he looked at me and said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. But the small thing, the specific thing, the fact that someone learned the particular frequency of my distress well enough to meet it before I even called, that is love. Not the idea of it, not the arrangement of it, but the actual granular daily practice of it, which is the willingness to learn another person as precisely and completely as you are capable of, and to keep learning them as they continue to become. He came to my door in the dark. He never moved back. And every morning since, when I wake up and there is warmth beside me and the sound of him breathing and the light coming through our windows into our room, I think there was a version of this story that didn't happen. There was a version where the distance stayed. Distance, where the arranged thing remained only arranged, where two people lived in the same house and never found the actual person living inside the other one. I am glad that is not the story we are in. This is the story we are in. Two men, imperfect and arrived at each other through imperfect means, who did the slow and necessary work of choosing each other every day until the choice became second nature, until it became something neither of us could imagine not making. He comes to me now when he has something difficult to carry. He comes without the hesitation that used to live between the wanting to and the doing of it. He sits beside me and he tells me things and I receive them, and then I do the same in return. And we carry things together the way people carry things when they have decided that the weight of a shared life is preferable to the lightness of a solitary one. The ring is the right size. The room is ours. And Walter Larkin. My cold, careful, deeply warm, slowly revealed, consistently surprising husband is asleep beside me right now, one hand resting open on the duvet in the particular way that means he is fully under, fully at rest. Fully here. That is everything. That is, specifically, everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.